Now our voyage takes us on this particular route, and I thought it was interesting that Queen Elizabeth is going up through New Guinea to the Philippines and to Japan, and that's pretty much the same route that General Douglas MacArthur took when he was trying to push the Japanese back towards Japan. I mean, he escaped from the Philippines. He was chased out of there. He escaped on a speedboat, came down to Australia, and of course organised the battle for Australia. And in some ways 1942 can be seen as possibly the most important date in Australia's history after 1788, the founding of the colony. Now, why is it so important? Well, in a sense, it stopped the Japanese from their objective, which was, if not to invade Australia, at least to cut it off from the United States. And it took an enormous amount of work to get the Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, and they have been decoding the Japanese signals, and along with the coast watchers, and I was told I had to mention coast watchers. Who asked me to mention coast watchers? Somebody said I had to mention coast watchers, because somebody here yesterday was involved with them, and they were very important too, sort of people hidden in the various islands like the Solomons who were forwarding information. So it was the breaking of the code that allowed the Americans to know exactly what was happening with the Japanese. And the Japanese were on their way to attack Port Moresby, and the Americans had the carriers Lexington and Yorktown. They had 2 Australian cruisers, the Australia and the Hobart. They had 6 US cruisers, and there were 12 British, United States and Australian destroyers. The Allies had 141 aircraft and the Japanese had 125. Now, Yamamoto's plan, he was the admiral, and I'm giving a talk about him after Rabaul, his assassination out of Rabaul. But Yamamoto was different to most admirals from Japan. He believed very strongly that aircraft were the key to modern warfare, and it's interesting that in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the battle was fought without any ships actually seeing each other. So the Battle of the Coral Sea was not decisive in the terms that there's not really one side that won, but the Battle of the Coral Sea was a pushback by the Australians and the Americans that stopped the Japanese in their tracks and saved Port Moresby. But then subsequently, a month later, very soon afterwards, you had the Battle of Midway, which was a very pivotal and important battle. And at Midway, Yamamoto's plan was to seize the tiny island of Midway with 5,000 troops and to lure the Americans from Pearl Harbor. But he didn't realize that the Americans already knew what he was doing, and the code had been broken, and all 4 of the Japanese carriers were turned into blazing wrecks. It's interesting that just after the war, a famous British historian, Sir Arthur Bryant, was asked what were the 3 most important battles in World War II, and he said El Alamein, Stalingrad, and the Battle of the Coral Sea. So in many people's minds, the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway are extremely important in the history of World War II. And I might just add on a personal note, my mother was at 2 of them. She was at El Alamein and near the Coral Sea as a nurse. Well, all this leads into the Battle of Milne Bay, because the Japanese are trying to get to Port Moresby. So after Battle of the Coral Sea is a failure for them, they decide to try and get to Port Moresby over the Owen Sandy. 1942 was by landing at get to Port Moresby, going on the Kokoda Track. By doing that, they were going to go they tried over the Owen Bay ranges to get in there and also come to Milne Bay. A key date is the landing of Americans at Guinea. In terms of Papua, 7th of August, they 1942 already land Japanese land at Buna, at Milne Bay, and on the 25th of August, which is the Battle of Milne Bay. Now, I want to show you, this is far too complicated for you to read from where you're sitting, but I just want to show you what the Americans had to go through after landing at Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, the number of landings that they had to go through to push the Japanese back up towards Japan. Now, each one of those red notations is a serious major landing of American forces trying to drive the Japanese out. And number 1 on the list of 78, number 1 is Guadalcanal on the 7th of August. Now, interestingly, Rabaul is not there. Rabaul's not on the list. Now, Rabaul, where we're going, was taken by the Japanese in 1942, and no one could get them out. They were entrenched in there. Said in 1942 was to get to Port Moresby, and by doing that, they were going to go. To do that, they had to go over the Owen Stanley Ranges on the Kokoda Track and also come into Milne Bay. So, in terms of Papua, they have already landed here at Buna and were now attacking Milne Bay. Just to show you what was happening in Australia, that represents the number of attacks by the Japanese on Australia. The larger the red dot, the more attacks. Darwin really copped it. You can see down the east coast of Australia a lot of attacks by ships. A lot of ships were attacked by Japanese subs, and Australia was under fire. If you saw Hugh Jackman's film, that's a still out of the film showing one of the bombing attacks on Darwin. And there's a map that's from the Japanese headquarters showing a planned attack on my hometown of Fremantle. Well, that didn't happen, but certainly everybody in Australia was very scared about what they thought was going to happen. They thought that the Japanese were going to attack, and kids were out in their schools at lunchtime digging trenches to hide in, and people were putting sandbags everywhere. There were smoke screens ready to be laid, and a lot of was the sort of headquarters of New Guinea for many years for the Australian mandated territory, and there wasn't much defending it. There was the Australian Lark Force, who were not that well trained and not that well led. And when the Japanese attacked in great numbers, the commander basically said, "Every man for himself," and the troops just disappeared into the jungle. Trying to stop the Japanese coming over the mountains to take Port Moresby. The young Australians, most of the initial ones were militia who weren't very well trained. They found it very hard work against the highly experienced and well-trained Japanese. They got pushed back, but eventually, with reinforcements arriving, they managed to stop the Japanese. So the Battle of Kokoda is an heroic effort by the Australians. An American reconnaissance photograph of Milne Bay, and you can look at that and you think, wow, that is rugged territory. Anybody who's fighting in that territory, it's really hard work with the mountains coming right down to the sea. It looks great, doesn't it? You look at the postcard picture there of Milne Bay. One Australian Navy commander wrote in his little book, "Milne Bay on the night of a full moon is a remarkably beautiful place. But in order to appreciate its attractions, one requires a long chair behind a gauze screen and a native boy to bring refreshments. Its beauty is sometimes hard to appreciate on tinned beef and hot chlorinated water." Well, the Americans moved in first to this area because MacArthur was building a secret air base. So the American engineers came in, and then the Australians came in later, and there's some Australian troops doing some exercises at Milne Bay. That's the Naval Signal Station, known as Boogie Woogie at Gilly Gilly. It's a shack on a tree. I don't think you'll find it there when we get there tomorrow. That was the scene on the beach, and this was the site of the Lever Brothers plantation. You all know Lever Brothers, the great soap manufacturers. They had they had a big plantation here for copra, and it was the Americans were building these runways there. It's quite amazing how fast these American engineers worked, and they had something called Marston matting, which was an ingenious metal set of squares which interlocked with each other. So you simply locked like Lego. You built some incredible artwork in their collection, and they've got some nice artwork of Milne Bay. So there's some sentries lighting their cigarettes at Milne Bay, and their invasion of Milne Bay. They came in on two different spots there. Now, both sides made mistakes, and the Japanese made quite a few. One of the things the Japanese got wrong was their reconnaissance wasn't very good. They had no idea there were so many troops in Milne Bay. They thought, oh, it's a new airfield, it's only just been started. There won't be a huge number of troops opposing us. So they sent in, this is 1942, and they sent in 1,943 troops. And don't forget, as I said, there's already 7,500 Australians there and 1,400 Americans. Not only did they make the mistake with not very good reconnaissance, but they also landed too far from the airfield. They got in, however, despite the Royal Australian Air Force trying to stop the convoy coming in with all the men and Japanese men and supplies, the RAF didn't do a very good job of stopping them. But there's one US Liberator set on fire by Japanese dive bombers and crash landed at Milne Bay. So William Dargy did a nice picture of the Australians in Milne Bay with their Kitty Hawk planes. He had been a very well-known pilot before he came to Milne Bay, and he took over as commander of the 76th Squadron, and he was told at night time, take your planes back to the safety of Port Moresby, and he refused to do that. He said, no, my guys are staying here in Milne Bay. Now that actually gave the Australians a bit of an advantage, because when the Japanese were coming in each day from Rabaul, when they were flying in, by the time they left Rabaul and got to Milne Bay, the weather could easily have changed. But Louis Truscott and his men being already there, the weather conditions, they knew exactly what was happening. Unfortunately, Louis Truscott was later killed himself in Western Australia. He was they don't know how he actually got into the Air Force, because he couldn't judge height. So how he landed and took off is a bit of a mystery sometimes, but he couldn't judge heights very well. But he ended up being this amazing squadron leader, and he actually killed himself in Western Australia. Very evocative and interesting artwork. There's a few here of Milne Bay, the Battle of Milne Bay. Some of the guns firing against the Japanese bombers. Dennis Adams' image. And the good thing that the RAF did in particular was basically getting rid of the landing barges. Most of the Japanese landing barges were smashed to pieces by the RAF, and that meant that the Japanese couldn't maneuver, and they were very lucky actually to get themselves out of Milne Bay. They certainly didn't get any decent reinforcements. Now, some of the things they brought to Milne Bay was quite interesting. For example, they brought bicycles. And I look at that bicycle and I think, well, that's interesting. First of all, it seems to have a license plate. I mean, I can't read Japanese, but it's got its own license plate. And you look at the seat on that bicycle, it's actually got springs at the front and springs at the back. Now, my $1,500 bicycle that got stolen last week from where I live in Perth, it didn't have fancy springs at the front and back. The Japanese equipment was pretty fancy sometimes. Now, they also brought their tanks to Milne Bay, and the story of this particular tank only came to light after a lot of detective work by various researchers. They found out that the tank commander had been shot dead by an Australian in the battle, and then the tank commander's replacement didn't have the skill to drive the tank in the dark, and ended up taking it off the road, and the other Japanese tank behind it also veered off the road, so both the Japanese tanks got bogged and became useless. That was the Japanese petrol wagon left behind, and some of the damage caused by the Japanese. Well, this Chinese freighter was attacked by the Japanese and sank, but interestingly it was fixed up and towed back to Sydney, 1,750 miles away. 3 Americans died on that ship when it was attacked. And the hospital ship Manunda, this photograph taken in Milne Bay, it had been heavily bombed in Darwin a few months earlier with 12 people killed on board. And don't forget, these are hospital ships that are well lit and with Red Cross signs everywhere and are not supposed to be attacked. At Milne Bay, it was interesting that 3 nights running the Japanese put their searchlights on this hospital ship and left it alone. So the Manunda survived, and during the war altogether it carried 30,000 casualties to safety. Just a reminder that off the coast of Queensland, hospital ships were not always immune from being attacked by the Japanese. The Centaur was sunk the next year, and 268 lives lost, including 11 of the 12 nurses on board. So the Australian government put out a poster, "Work, Save, Fight." I mean, people were getting pretty stirred up about some of the atrocities in World War II. There was some amazing fighting in Milne Bay. The Japanese were Marines, which is not quite the same as American Marines, but they were experienced troops. They fought very hard, but they were obviously outnumbered, and the conditions of fighting in that wet, muddy, horrible terrain was quite horrendous. One Australian, Corporal John French, he won a Victoria Cross. He told his men to stay back. He went ahead with some hand grenades and wiped out a Japanese machine gun post. Then he got a submachine gun and went ahead and wiped out another Japanese post, and it was on the 3rd post that he was attacking that he was killed. So what was the end result of the Battle of Milne Bay? It was the first defeat of the Japanese on land, and 171 Allied servicemen killed, 216 wounded, and so the loss of life was not horrendous, but of the Japanese, of their landing force, 625 died, 311 were evacuated as wounded. And I'll just throw in a little personal story here. My uncle was a pilot. He wasn't anywhere near New Guinea. He was shot down in Burma, and he was my mother's brother. And you can imagine the trauma of anyone losing family members in these wars, and it still resonates down today. I mean, I lost an uncle who I never got to see, and this is my mother writing to her parents when she was in Port Moresby as a nurse, and she's just saying, "I wish, darlings, I was with you when you receive Frank's things." So having been killed in action as a RAF pilot, they pack up with the dead men, they pack up all their things and send them back to their loved ones. And she was, I mean, it's quite amazing, 10,754 Australians died, RAF men died in World War II overall. That's quite a huge loss of highly trained airmen. And in Christmas time, she writes from New Guinea, she writes, "Feel very lonely this Christmas, don't you? We can only pray the war finishes before many more wonderful lives are lost. There is a struggle for life of an only son here. He has tetanus from a bomb explosion." Red is the Australians pushing up against the Japanese, and the black are the Americans. And you can see how busy the Australians and the Americans were from 1943 to 1944 with all sorts of various operations. And then comes the Japanese surrender. there's a very interesting story about what happened after the war in Rabaul in terms of looking after this huge number of Japanese and making them look after themselves and had to build their own camps until they got repatriated. When Rabaul was relieved, these nuns had been there right through the whole time, and Rabaul was impregnable because hundreds of miles of tunnels had been built. I hope you get a chance to go and see some of the tunnels when you get to Rabaul. 600 surrendered British soldiers from Singapore, for example, had been brought to Rabaul simply just to dig tunnels. Now, in my talk yesterday, I talked about the first Australian to die in World War I, and also the doctor, Lieutenant Pockley, who were killed, and I showed you their war memorials, and here the Japanese had desecrated all of those when they occupied Rabaul. At the end of the war, there were 188 war crime trials held in Rabaul to deal with various war crimes, and this particular Japanese prisoner was on trial for eating an Australian soldier, and in fact he was dobbed in by one of his own men who was standing on the right. So 188 war trials in Rabaul, and if there's a couple of things I'd like you to take away from today's talk. One is that the indigenous people in this beautiful part of the world, they didn't ask for us to come and take over their country and have wars in the middle of their civilization, but we've done that to them, and I do hope that the people of New Guinea have a good future, and that these very delicate sort of civilizations that exist living in rural towns and living off the land, I hope that they can survive and don't get taken over.
This is where the Japanese landed, in Milne Bay, and then they made their way along here, walked along here on the roads constructed by the Allies, and got as far right along here, continued up here, and got as far as here, where they were stopped trying to get to the airstrip. This is where the Kitty Hawk came in, flown by Turnbull, and clipped these trees trying to shoot some Japanese, and he went down here. And an airstrip was named after him, but he came from this direction, came around the mountain, flying low in the Kitty Hawk, and crashed. And the airstrip we're going to next, along this direction, was named after him in his honour. Behind the same area is where the Victoria Cross was won.
But we had the invasion force that actually arrived here on August 25th, about 11 p.m. at a village called Wahuba, which lies across this way down about 20 kilometers or so away from Coroni Creek. They were supposed to land down here at a village called Rabi. And Rabi is where you can see the bay going in, the water, the sea, the bay just gone in. Around that area, the other side, is called Rabi village. A fierce battle occurred down here with KB Mission. You can see the red roofs down further here, down to the beach. The point, that's where Rabi KB Mission is, where the 61st Battalion's at the headquarters. Coming back to the to the bay itself. From that point at Kanakope, you can see the point going out, sticking out, all the way down towards the bay here, about 135 kilometers in length and 10 to 16 kilometers in width is the length and width of the bay. The name Milne Bay from. And about 500 itself. When the Allied forces first arrived here, they went in through those islands there, the 4 islands you can see, and they went in through there, right down to Gabugabuna, and later moved inland towards Gili, where the Allied forces had their headquarters built in there, and the first airstrip was built. It took 22 days for the first airstrip to be built, and then they moved in towards the western side, about another 10 to 15 kilometers away, and built another airstrip at Waigani. It was not used because of waterlogged. Then they did construct another airstrip down further, closer to Rabi village, which they called airstrip number 3. Today we have airstrip number 1 as our commercial airstrip, named after Captain Bob Gurney, and it's called Gurney Airport today. Captain Bob Gurney's plane actually crashed on the Trobriand Islands, and that's where he is. Airstrip number 3 was later built. Because of Flight Lieutenant Peter Turnbull of the 76 Squadron's plane crashed in this area where your tour guide showed you, the airstrip was named after him, in memorial of Peter Turnbull War Memorial. That's what it's called today. When they were spotted by the Allied forces who were flying from, the USA Air Force who were flying from Charters Towers in Queensland towards Guadalcanal. Because Guadalcanal, the Americans were landing in there and Japanese were pushing all the troops towards Guadalcanal. So they had all the troops from Gona, Buna, Sanananda, moving them out from that area going towards. So they believed that whatever Imperial forces that the platoons that they sent down here was enough to combat the Allied forces here, not knowing how many army personnel were here. So they thought that the 2,000 soldiers they brought here was enough to take over the airstrips here within 48 hours. It never happened because they landed away from Rabi village. And they were supposed to take over airstrip within 48 hours. Another lot of Japanese came along on the other side, trying to call in over the range here at a village called Taupota to land here and assist those ones that were already here. Went into good enough island. And when they went into good enough island, they were all marooned and couldn't come across this way. So that held them up. And these were the only platoons who went in, but was later reinforced with some more 2,000 men came later on. But 10 to 1, the Allied Army personnel alone was 8,824 personnel already here. That's including 7th, 18th Brigade, and the engineering battalions were here. So, not knowing the Japanese, not knowing the strength of the force of the Allied forces here. So this is where they made their mistake. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Custodians, I would like to welcome every one of you to Turnbull War Memorial. If you're not sure where is Strip 3, we are all standing on top of Strip 3. Strip 3 starts from the foot of the mountain and it goes all the way down to the waterfront, just at a corner, and you look straight down the new trees coming up. That's how far it goes. It's 1,800 meters long and 85 meters wide. From that drainage on that side, and turn back to the other side of the road, the tall trees, that's how wide Strip 3 is. My grandparents, aunties, uncles, mother lived here before the war came. In the late 18th, the first missionaries arrived here with the Samoans, Methodists. That's where my grandparents went to school, and they knew how to speak fluent English.
It's written by a SEPA, Australian engineer, called Beth Barrows. And Beth Barrows wrote this poem at 4 a.m. in the morning. while on stand 2 on the Kokoda Track. This range here connects to the Owen Stanley Ranges, where the famous Kokoda Track battles were fought. Fuzzy-wuzzy angels. Many a mother in Australia, when the busy day is done, sends a prayer to the Almighty for the keeping of his son, asking that an angel guide him back and bring him safely back. Now we see those prayers are answered on the Owen Stanley Track. For they haven't any halos, only holes slashed in their ears, and their faces worked by tattoos with scratch pins in their hair, bringing back the badly wounded just as steady as a horse, using leaves to keep the rain off, and gentle as a nurse. Slow and careful in the bad places on that awful mountain track. The look upon their faces would make you think Christ was black. Not a move to head the wounded as they treat him like a saint. It's a picture worth recording that an artist yet to paint. Many a lad will see their mother and husband see their wives, just because the fuzzy-wuzzy carried them to save their lives. From mortar bombs and machine gun fire or chance surprise attacks, to the safety and care of doctors at the bottom of the track. May the mothers of Australia, when they offer a prayer, mention those impromptu angels with their fuzzy-wuzzy head. First Pacific Islands Regiment, Papua New Guinea Defence Force, based in Toowoomba Barracks, Port Moresby. One of their regimental colours is Milne Bay, and Milne Bay is this battle here. 3 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of August 1942, the Japanese had infiltrated all the way. They had made their way right up until, if you look across to those two coconuts, that is where the Japanese were ready to mount an attack to capture this airstrip. I'll send you a map around. This map was drawn to me by one of the veterans here who was defending this airstrip. If you look to the corner of the road here, how they defended this airstrip, they dug a huge pit straight down the corner here at the edge of the runway. Beside that pit, they had a huge minefield. On the runway itself, they ran a long concertina of barbed wire straight down the middle. There's a hill over this tree growth here. They had a company of soldiers up there. They knew the tactic of the Japanese. If they mount a frontal attack, they get pushed back, they will flank. So those troops were up there to cut off this flanking movement. The Japanese were here. When they look across empty airfield, they could just work out the gleaming barbed wire. You know where the troops were hiding? If you look across to your back on the other side of the road, they are all ready there, all lined up, armed with their personal weapons, .303 rifles, Brand guns, heavy Vickers machine guns. The US engineers also mounted their half-track, high-caliber machine guns. If you look at the map, you'll see the different sections where they were supposed to protect. They had mortars and then artillery on standby. This was the last stand. If they broke through here, all the aircraft were at number 1. Prior to that, an order had been issued down to withdraw the aircraft and fly them back to Port Moresby. This kind of demoralized the troops on the ground, because this aircraft provided a vital air cover for the land troops. On the morning of that attack, the Japanese were already up here. They looked across, no troops. The troops were in hiding. So one of the Japanese shouted across, "It's hopeless, Johnny. We are coming across." You know what the response he got? Somebody called out from the dark there. They don't know who it was. He shouted across, "Pigs, as you are, Let them all have it. Now that was the signal for this whole area to erupt in gunfire. One veteran showed me, he even drew the picture. The rounds flying across, hitting the Japanese. All the heavier guns, they all poured their fire. So obviously the Japanese tried to flank. They swung up this way, they were fired upon, so they swung it again. And obviously they ended up down. That big ditch they dug eventually became a mass grave. And they ended up in that minefield down there. Now these Japanese troops were Marines. I believe you're going to Rabaul? They came out of Rabaul. So they were 10 back here. This was the beginning of the end of the Japanese occupation of New Guinea. These troops came out and they chased them all the way up. They went up the coast. They were later redeployed. If you are a war historian and you follow war history in PNG, Battle of Buna, Gona, Sanananda, Awala, all the way up to Ley, eventually across to Rabaul, onto Bougainville, and even to Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. So this was here, place here, where 76 years ago, the Japanese were 10 back for the first time. And that was one of the first in this battle here. Another first, being the three elements of the Australian Army fighting together. Elements of the Royal Australian Navy, Royal Australian Air Force, and the two infantry brigades, the 7th and the 18th, who were here. Another first was the use by the Royal Australian Air Force of the T-40 Kitty Hawk aircraft. Just responding. They went with songs to the battle. They were young. Straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest you forget. Thank you.
I hear the trumpet calling as clear as a bell, sounding over bloody fields, so many young men fell. At the dawn we honor them, each and every one, lest you be forgotten, our brave Australians. I am every Australian who answered freedom's call to leave their homes and loved ones and fight on foreign shores. At Gallipoli and Lone Pine their legend was begun. I am the unknown soldier, I am Australian. We are one, but we are many, and from all the lands on earth we come. We share a dream and sing with one voice. I am, you are, we are Australian. Your sons and your daughters are now marching by your side. They carry your battle flags and say your names with pride. Your courage and your mateship in all of us lives on. I am the Anzac spirit, I am Australian. We are one, but we are many, and from all the lands on earth we come. and sing with one voice. I am, you are, we are Australian.
Now when I was a young man, I carried me pack, and I lived the free life of the rover. From the Murray's green basin to the dusty outback, well, I waltzed my Matilda all over. Then in 1915, my country said, son, it's time you stop rambling, there's work to be done. So they gave me a tin hat and they gave me a gun, and they marched me away to the war. And the band played waltzing Matilda as the ship pulled away from the quay. And amidst all the cheers, the flag waving and tears, we sailed off for Gallipoli. And how well I remember that terrible day, how our blood stained the sand and the water, and of how in that hell that they called Suvla Bay, we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turk, he was waiting, he'd primed himself well. He showered us with bullets and he rained us with shell, and in 5 minutes flat he'd blown us all to hell. Nearly blew us right back to Australia. But the band played waltzing Matilda when we stopped to bury our slain. We buried ours and the Turks buried theirs. Then we started all over again. And those that were left, well, we tried to survive in that mad world of blood, death and fire. And for 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive, though around me the corpses piled higher. Then a big Turkish shell knocked me arse overhead, and when I woke up in me hospital bed and saw what it had done, well, I wished I was dead. Never knew there was worse things than dying. For I'll go no more waltzing Matilda all around the green bush far and free. To hum tent and pegs, a man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. So they gathered the crippled, the wounded, the maimed, and they shipped us back home to Australia. The legless, the armless, the blind, the insane, those proud wounded heroes of Suvla. And as our ship pulled into Circular Quay, I looked at the place where me legs used to be, and thank Christ there was nobody waiting for me to grieve, to mourn and to pity. But the band played Waltzing Matilda as they carried us down the gangway. But nobody cheered, they just stood and stared. Then they turned all their faces away. And so now, every April, I sit on me porch and I watch the parade pass before me. And I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, reviving old dreams of past glories. And the old men march slowly, all bones stiff and sore. They're tired old heroes from a forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. But the band plays Waltzing Matilda, and the old men still answer the call. But as year follows year, more old men disappear. Someday no one will march there at all. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? And their ghosts may be heard as they march by that billabong. Who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me?
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
When the world seems to shine like you've had too much wine, that's amore.